So, hello and welcome everyone, and to those out there in internet land. My name is Ben Harris. I'm the editor-in-chief and publisher of Newspace, which is an oil, gas, energy publication, 20 years pedigree, which covers all these things. In addition, I'm the founder and editor of IntelliNews, IntelliNews.com. We cover both publications. The global IntelliNews is more, and we focus mainly on emerging markets. IntelliNews is more on the financial political side, and Newspace is aimed at energy professionals, the big producers, and governments and think tanks and what have you. It's kind of serious. Today we're going to talk about hydrogen and the perspective of hydrogen's use in Europe, a topic that we cover. I'd point your attention to the newspace.com site, where we cover this as one of the many topics we do, renewables in general, the green transition, as well as traditional oil and gas. What makes us unique is that we have bureaus across the region, in Baku, in Moscow, in Kiev, Ankara, throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, our Peruvian correspondents at the back. And we cover it on a daily basis. I'd like to introduce the speakers. To my left is Tom O'Donnell, a nuclear scientist, also a fellow at the Wilson Center. And next to him is Dr. Dawood Ansari, who's at the German Institute for International Security Affairs, SWP, who's also energy expert. And joining us from Kiev is, he's their video link, Roman Nitsovich, who's the director of research at Dixie, which is a think tank. Roman, you can hear me, I'm sure. There he is. Dixie, which is a think tank and advisory that's based in Kiev. Good afternoon, Roman. How's the weather in Kiev?
So far, so warm. It's still warm here.
If you've never been to Kiev, you should go. It's a beautiful city. I want to make a few introductory remarks about the challenge that we face with hydrogen. If you could put up my slide, please. Roman, we'll come to you in a minute, okay? We're just going to have a few speakers, yeah. So the thing with hydrogen is supposed to be the fuel of tomorrow. Russian gas is gone, and we need to replace it with something that's clean. Hydrogen has been put forward as a solution, but it's a mountain to climb to get there. Under the Repower EU program, the plan is to produce green hydrogen, 10 million tons a year, and import another 10 million tons a year from outside in order to power the industries. The trouble is at the moment, the production in Europe is, last year was only 31,000 tons of green hydrogen and 44,000 tons of blue hydrogen. In other words, green hydrogen, electrolysis from water; blue hydrogen, you take methane and crack it into the respective parts. Which means that the target to produce this 20 million tons of hydrogen by 2030 is pretty much impossible. It's just not going to happen, which is a huge problem. And the idea of importing it, as the chart shows, there's 2 million tons of blue hydrogen in all of North America and only 19,000 tons of green. Africa, it's basically non-existent. South America, non-existent. Europe, it's nominal. And Asia, again, almost 2 million tons of blue hydrogen and 93,000 tons of green hydrogen, which is consumed by Asia by itself, and it's still far short. So this is going to be a real problem, that hydrogen in the short term is not going to work, that there's going to have to be some sort of compromise, a mix. And the money's being poured in, but the level of investment is way too small. I mean, the EU have the Hydrogen Bank, and in April they dedicated 720 million euros to that for investment for projects. It needs to be 7 billion. I mean, it's an order of magnitude too small. And then you have other problems, because it looks like the energy equation in making green hydrogen is so much more energy intensive that the renewable power sources available, solar, wind, in order to do the electrolysis is far insufficient in order to provide the energy you need to make green hydrogen. which means if we are going to go down the hydrogen road, it's going to be blue hydrogen, which means we have to continue to import gas and then crack it. The other problem, obviously, with blue is that you have CO2 as a byproduct, and that needs to be dealt with. And the carbon capture and storage technology, it works, but the efficiency is 70%, it's 90% in the labs, but it's not on an industrial scale. And on top of that, you have the problem of where to store the CO2. Basically, the plan is to pump it underground, but those storage facilities don't exist. I mean, you have the option maybe of re-inflating the Groningen gas field in Holland, which is half empty and causing earthquakes. That's an option. But again, this is all just on the drawing board at the moment. And remember, the deadline is 2030. That's 7 years away to get to this. So it's an enormous story. Another problem you have with the hydrogen is transport, that the existing pipelines cannot be used for hydrogen. The problem is it's so small that it worms its way in between the metal atoms of the pipelines and corrodes them. So the UK just did a test where they took some disused pipelines and pumped hydrogen through it. And they found if you mix it with methane, then up to a 20% mix, that works. But going to 100% doesn't, because you'll degrade the pipes. So it means, again, in the short term, we're looking at a solution that continues to use natural gas in a mix where you start to dilute it with some hydrogen, and then we're talking, I don't know, a couple of decades until we make the transition to full hydrogen, but it's still a long way away. So on that sort of pessimistic note, I mean, it's a good idea, but as I say, we're very skeptical that it can be done, and we don't see the political will nor the capital going into it to make it happen anywhere within the timeline. This is a much longer term problem, but at the same time, the climate crisis is accelerating. I mean, the failure to include the aerosols into the models means that the heating is going faster than all the scientists expect, and we're kind of running out of time. So there should be a call to action. Put in the money, make a concerted effort, but we're not really seeing that. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to, who we can start with, Tom? With Davut, please. So I hand the floor over to Davut.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me today. I was hoping the intro would be a little bit more light and more I don't know, positively toned, because I'm afraid that Tom and I won't be adding many positive notes either. But nonetheless, this is hopefully giving grounds for a quite vivid. Not yet, but I really feel it fits the atmosphere. So I will try to keep it balanced at the very least. No. So what I'm mainly going to refer to in the next 10 minutes, and I try not to overstretch time in order to, especially since we have a very distinguished and nonetheless exclusive round today, I'd far more like to focus on Q&A from my side. I'll give, however, some overview of the work that we did over the past, that me and my research team at the SWP did over the past 3 years. We looked extensively, especially at the geopolitical side of what hydrogen means, and that obviously does also encompass the techno-economics of hydrogen, but we mainly focus on A, the international dimension of hydrogen, and B, what does it mean to the energy system in general, what does it also particularly mean to international relations and to the production of power in energy. You can find all of our publications online, feel free to have a look at them. And so I would perhaps mostly like to start with the point that the discussion that we have on hydrogen today in 2024 is absolutely by no means the same discussion that we had in 2021. So all actors have, and their positions have evolved substantially over the past 3 years. Let me perhaps start a little bit with how Europe, generally speaking, has evolved. One particular thing that I personally noticed is that indeed there is still, so you already mentioned financing is obviously one of the of the strong points. And yes, there is still momentum in Europe and also in Germany in particular to keep hydrogen going. This is still an important mission for everyone. Nonetheless, I do strongly feel from talks to policymakers and also from talks to the industry, and also particularly when going to industry events, that we kind of surpassed the point of maximum hype, and people have increasingly arrived in a sphere of more realism and more pragmatism when it comes to hydrogen. So some of the sums that people initially thought about investing, they're not really there anymore. The budgets turned out to be smaller. So generally speaking, interest is still there. However, it is kind of smaller to some extent. What we also see in Europe is, generally speaking, vis-a-vis hydrogen, that there has some kind of of a more pragmatic approach to its sustainability standards and to its of what exactly is actually clean hydrogen. So that in 2021 we started at a rather narrow idea of what exactly is the hydrogen that Europe wants, and this has continuously become more pragmatic and more flexible to some extent. However, one major trend that we also see, especially from 2021 to now, is the geopolitization of hydrogen. So generally speaking, well, Europe has to some extent over the past 20 years lived in a vacuum sort of sense. So I don't know. So I'm not really in favor of the statement that with the war in Ukraine, the world has been re-geopolitized. I wouldn't say that it's Europe that has been re-geopolitized through the events in Ukraine and Russia, whereas the rest of the world has had very, very different experiences, and that is somewhat also mapped into a sea in hydrogen. So for instance, if we look particularly more towards the Middle East and Asia, then we do to some extent have the opposite trend. So we do have a shift from a geopolitized world towards a more geo-economized world, so towards a world that less relies on security incidents to some extent, and rather goes towards an economic dimension of capturing a lot of that. Generally speaking, when we talk about the geopolitics of hydrogen, that has many different dimensions. One important thing, obviously, to capture the geography of all of this. If we look at this map, so in brown colors, so you can find this map in a recent report, the landmark report, the geopolitics of hydrogen. So in the brownish areas are areas that are top natural gas producers. In red, you do find areas that are especially prone to solar energy production, and thus also potentially green hydrogen from solar energy. And in blue, you find areas that are especially prone to its producing wind power, and thus potentially green hydrogen from wind power. As we can generally see, yes, over the entire globe, renewable energy is obviously more evenly distributed, or let me rather say less concentrated than fossil fuels. Nonetheless, it is wrong to believe that if we include economic efficiency as a criteria, as a standard, it is wrong to believe that everything can randomly produce hydrogen. We can't do everything from an engineering point of view, that's not the question, but obviously if we include economic viability in the broadest means, then the regions that can, or from an economic point, should produce hydrogen, it starts to get smaller. At the same time, what obviously we need to think about more and more is we need to think about security of the security of maritime and of maritime trade routes and pipelines. So here in blue, you do find a couple of choke points along ways. And then one important dimension that is more and more important in hydrogen. So one thing that clearly distinguishes hydrogen from other from the fossil fuel industry in particular, hydrogen is getting more complicated. That's an important point to realize. So switching to hydrogen means that tracking value chains, tracking supply chains, this gets insanely more complicated. Simply because, as a matter of fact, value and supply chains are longer. So we eventually start with critical raw materials. They need to be processed. They need to be processed. They need to be turned into critical components. Some of which only come from a specific list of countries. They eventually need to be used to be. They eventually need to produce solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. So we're far longer way. And obviously, so one of the core questions was also the readiness of technology. Yes, we should be transparent that especially here on the technology, on the downstream technology, here on the upstream, things are pretty pretty smooth. Here on the downstream side, yes, things are less ready than people would like it. So we have a couple of different technologies that we can use in order to use hydrogen. As mentioned, pipelines are an option. However, building new pipelines, let's be honest, we've seen how efficient public projects have been run over the past years. Building a new pipeline for hydrogen might be a project of a decade or even longer, and it will include substantial political capital that has become rare these days. If we talk about maritime trade, that is definitely possible. So here we less have an issue of possibility, but with current technology, it's very, very expensive. Projections of international organizations mainly hint at liquid hydrogen. So freezing hydrogen until it becomes liquid might be the best option in the long run. Nonetheless, frankly, I don't really see the trend going there at the moment. I don't see the progress going there at the moment. At the moment, it's still very expensive. What we can do quite efficiently is we can turn hydrogen into ammonia or similar things. That is a viable business case if it is about decarbonizing current ammonia needs to decarbonize in the fertilizer industry. However, retransforming, so cracking up the ammonia into hydrogen is pretty energy wasteful. So there is still a lot of technological uncertainty down there. One thing that needs much more attention when it comes to hydrogen is obviously critical raw materials. Depending on the electrolyzer technology that we talk about, there are substantial dependencies with respect to individual regions around the globe. So the entire idea that was kind of floating around in the discourse of hydrogen hydrogen having the potential to actually to decrease dependencies of Europe and to increase strategic autonomy. That is something that, given the long value chain, the essential dependencies through the value chain, that is very questionable. Switching over quickly, and overstretching the time, to how has the discussion evolved on the side of potential hydrogen suppliers, potential hydrogen exporters. Something we've seen very strongly is, and that is frankly something very negative that happened, especially in 2021, 2022, both the EU and Germany made a number of MOUs that were hinting at the possibility of green hydrogen trade corridors. Unfortunately, from a European point of view, they were meant as very broad declarations of interest, so rather declarations of interest to explore the possibility, whereas in many potential exporter economies, these MOUs were taken very seriously. And what we've been seeing increasingly is that the overall policy of jetting around the world and making MOUs with every potential supplier without actually having the attention to follow up has been increasingly eroding also Europe's entire reputation as an actor in trade. So what I'm encountering increasingly in talks with business leaders and also with policymakers around the world is that Europe is increasingly seen as an actor that is not really credible when it comes to any of those issues, and that is something, be it true or be it not, it is a reason for concern. Additionally, what we see is the discussion has strongly shifted from exports being the main thing you want to do with hydrogen, so you want to just export hydrogen, towards, well, hydrogen might be something very valuable for the local, actually more valuable for the local market, because increasingly countries have come to understand that the actual margins that you can make from exporting hydrogen, they tend to be rather low actually, and especially since one of the open questions is who should bear the risk eventually. So obviously Europe would like a business model in which potential exporters, they invest into hydrogen infrastructure, and then one day, once it's finished, Europe can come and buy the hydrogen, like I call it a petrol station model. There's obviously something exporters don't really want. Exporters want actually Europe as the off-taker to carry the risk and to take care of the investments, which is something that is here seen very very critical, since especially off-takers tend to be reluctant to invest in hydrogen. So this is an ongoing debate that is so to say still there, and so from a European perspective, before I give it over to you, one big question has been, and to some extent it still is, the question: who are Europe's potential partners when it comes to importing hydrogen? So given that, and this is now a big assumption, so assuming that Europe will eventually import hydrogen. How exactly should this look like, and what are potential criteria to evaluate this based on? So some major trend that we've seen is that, and that hasn't started with the war on Ukraine, but has definitely exacerbated through the war on Ukraine, is the tendency to not mainly look at this through a lens of economics or of the energy system, or or not necessarily even a lens of geopolitical risk, but strongly speaking also let me stay there for a second. Strongly speaking, also through the lens of, let me say, in the broadest sense, non-economic, broader policy values. So friendshoring has become a major idea. So the idea, should Europe perhaps only, or Germany particularly, only take hydrogen from countries that it at least perceives, if they are, this is a very different question, but at least countries that Europe perceives to be its allies and similar. This, broadly speaking, so Germany does now have an input strategy that broadly captures some idea about where hydrogen might come from. That makes a lot of sense. That includes obviously Germany's closest neighbors within the EU and within the closest EU neighborhood. However, something that we've increasingly seen concern with is that, especially towards non-European partners, the choice towards which countries might be prospective partners, again, is not one that is, and I think Tom might be talking much more about this, it is not necessarily one that is bound to economic realities, which partners are actually potentially able to build infrastructure and to go, and that neither into the question, how do we actually spread geopolitical risk or similar. However, Germany has increasingly shown the tendency to rely on a small number of countries that are, frankly, especially from a geopolitical perspective, that don't come without substantial risk. That being said, where does hydrogen go from here in a broad sense? So I would say to perhaps, to look into the glass ball. What we will definitely see is hydrogen has become a project that is, from many perspectives, too big to fail. Many parties have made substantial investments. Europe, obviously, but also, to point this here on the map, obviously also countries through the Middle East. So on the left-hand side, you do have a map. This is from 2022, but it's still, so there are new projects now, but it still gives an overall picture through the Arab Gulf states. On the right-hand side, you do have Oman in particular. So especially look at Oman, but also other countries in the region. Morocco, for instance, is an example. Hydrogen has become a topic that is so large and has been so prominent in the public discourse that it is, from a political economy point of view, is there an option to just let hydrogen go? So there will need to be some projects. It might be dependent on how much Europe is eventually willing to invest and willing to import. It might not be the size of projects, the number of projects initially seen, but we will definitely see some hydrogen projects going on, and in those areas where we use hydrogen directly, that is something where the decarbonization of the fertilizer industry, for instance, that is something that is very likely. However, whether we will really see hydrogen entering Europe as a central energy carrier, that is something that is definitely far from being certain. I would keep it at that for the moment, and then obviously wait more for my other co-panelists and also for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Should we go to Roman?
Yeah.
So can we switch to Roman, who's in Kiev?
Just reflecting on what you asked about the weather in Kiev. It's sunny, but we had another sleepless night with another massive attack with cruise missile and ballistic missiles. So for now, hydrogen, it's not on the top of the agenda, as you might imagine. So on top of the agenda is defending our our energy system and ensuring that we will have generation repaired, but also new generation constructed before the winter starts, so we can pass through this winter season without major outages for households and for industry. So in this regard, I would like to thanks to Germany, which actually acts like a real ally and supplied Ukraine with many weapons to defend itself, starting from Gepard anti-aircraft guns to Patriot surface to air missile system and IRIS-T systems, and up to kind of experimental systems like Skynet short-range anti-aircraft guns. So I wish that all of our allies were that consistent in their pledges and in their support to Ukraine. Coming back to hydrogen, of course, given that current priorities are on security, it doesn't mean that hydrogen is off the agenda. It is obvious that we have quite good potential in terms of becoming that country of friend sharing, as you mentioned, due to several reasons. The one reason is, of course, geographic location and general potential of renewable energy, which can be achieved both in solar and wind. And we are closer to use than even African countries, because we do not need to cross the Mediterranean. Second, I think argument is because of legal approximation, which is even more important given the start of negotiations process in terms of EU accession. So we will be definitely looking into adoption of legislation to be compliant with the recently adopted decarbonized gas and hydrogen market package in the EU. We are closely, so Ukrainian stakeholders are closely looking into the way the regulatory framework is developing, but also different industrial initiatives are developing. So our companies, primarily the transmission system operator in gas, is part of several initiatives. One of them is a consortium of 4 TSOs. So it's Ukraine, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Germany, which are conceptualizing and will be developing so-called Central European Hydrogen Corridor, which would serve as as a kind of supply route for future hydrogen production. As for not potential, but to the plans, so of course Ukraine is named among key partners, starting from the first European strategy on hydrogen. I think it's 2021, as early as 2021. And we were mentioned in several other industry initiatives, like the 2 per 40 gigawatt initiative, with the role of Ukraine to have at least 8 gigawatts capacity for renewable energy capacity for hydrogen production, and another 1.8 for green ammonia production. However, I also need to mention that we have a draft hydrogen strategy of Ukraine, which is anticipating industrial production as early as 2030, the start of industrial production, and potential exports in 2035 at the level of 0.4 million tons. This could grow by 2050 to 1.5 or 2 million tons. So these are the plans. Of course, I share the concerns mentioned earlier in the event regarding, technological challenges and, the need to invest in further technological advancement, both on the production side, new electrolyzer technologies, but also on the transportation side, in terms of improving the liquid organic hydrogen carriers technology and other technologies. In terms of transport, I would also mention that those liquid organic carriers, we can use oil transmission infrastructure once we phase out, supplies through the Druzhba pipeline system. I think this year we sent some strong signals to those countries which are still importing Russian crude oil, and still using this derogation in the EU sanction regime. So it's an opportunity we may also consider. As for other products like green ammonia, which could be produced from green hydrogen, Ukraine also has an export terminal in Odessa and a major pipeline which used to ship ammonia of Russian origin. So we may also use this infrastructure with minor upgrades to look into the opportunities for exporting green hydrogen-based products like green ammonia. Let me think. I think that's key.
Welcome to the Berlin Energy Forum.
I wanted to highlight.
I just was I always sit when I'm listening to these discussions and think, because I'm a nuclear physicist, and before, when I was, I did engineering work before I got involved in geopolitics and stuff. I actually had to work with hydrogen, and I actually had to work with ammonia and cryogenics, sometimes on industrial scale. So I'd love to talk to you about the technical problems, but and I can tell you some stories later, but that's not the focus here. Whoops. There we go. So why is green hydrogen suddenly, and its derivatives suddenly become such an important point? And it's intended as a solution to a crisis, in particularly in Germany, the crisis of the model for energy transition and security. But right now, the de facto solution is something else. It's actually natural gas, and it's actually growing. So if you were just standing back and looking at Germany from outside, you didn't listen to what people were saying, you'd say, these people are clearly on a path of renewable electricity plus natural gas. And there's some other things going on. So there's de facto, and then there's what's intended. Well, to a certain extent, I think this denies science and also the realities of the African countries that are being approached, in the sense that, they have problems of transition themselves, and what you have to go through to export this, really, and the efficiencies that Dawood mentioned, you might want to keep it in those countries. So everybody knows about this, but I just want to bring it up as some perspective. From the very beginning, I went back and looked at sort of the fathers or mothers, one or two mothers, but mainly the fathers of this idea of the Energiewende, people like Amory Lovins in the US and others. And right from almost the beginning, everybody said, yes, we can have a system with 100% renewables, and why they thought it was so positive. But everybody said, of course, there's a problem with the weather. It wasn't like an expose of that model. It was from the beginning known, but there's all this sort of techno-optimism that, of course, we can develop the technology, and kind of united with the techno-optimism of the IT age and so forth. And so the thing was, if you think about it a little bit, this variability problem is really an Achilles heel. You not only have the daily variability, right? That you have to produce in the times when it's windier and sunnier, produce extra energy to feed back in. But you have these periods of Dunkelflaute or something like that, long periods of time. So when you start thinking about, you can have a situation where almost nothing is produced for a period of time, right? And so in practice, the tendency is to keep an entire renewable system and an almost entire natural gas system in parallel. Okay, and that's, two systems, and then there's the expenses, right? And we could talk about that. So there's various things that people have tried. Well, one thing you would do is, well, then you better expand renewables much more than you need in any given day so that you have a lot to store for the days you don't have it. So that's why Mr. Habeck decided when he came in office 2% of entire Germany's land should be covered with windmills, which I think is just not feasible when you think about what that would mean. The other thing is, well, the independent monitors report, the one in 2021 of the Energiewende, said that it's not possible for Germany to produce enough renewables on its own territory, right? And there was already these ideas about hydrogen floating around and ideas about importing electricity in the local states here, but from distances away. So this sort of locked it in. And it didn't start with, it was the CDU and it was Altmaier who really got involved in this, and it was carried on by this project was carried on by the current coalition. So it's interesting. In order to, another thing that was done to avoid local variations is say, well, we make the grids bigger and bigger. And I remember when the debate was, do we need big grids or little grids? That's been settled, right? All the stuff that was promoted before about mini grids, local control, or energy democracy has gone away, and the bigger the grid is, the more stability. This is another attempt to solve the problem, and also HVDC lines, long distance, high voltage direct current lines, and we know that's not going so well after many years in Germany. The other thing was a lot of subsidized R&D for long-term, generalizable, cheap tech for storage. And it's been 30 years that, batteries were going to be the next thing. I remember when cellulosic ethanol, billions were being put in the United States too, but it got killed pretty quick. It just, the numbers weren't there for it to do what wanted to be done. And I won't go through them, compressed air, biofuels, there's all sorts of ideas. In reality, 93% or 92% of all installed grid scale storage in the world is pumped hydro. That's worldwide. It's also the number in the United States. And pumped hydro is great, but you need certain conditions. And this area we're in, from sort of Paris up to Moscow, the military people call it the Great Northern Plain. So there's a big limit, obviously, right? So that's not generalizable. It's great once you do it, but it's very expensive. Once you do it, it'll last forever, right? And the largest battery farms, people tell me, about Musk's battery farm in Australia, they will tell you, the Australians, this is not for grid scale storage. This is for balancing the grid, right? This is so you don't get a lags in frequency. So the de facto solution is natural gas. That's what is being used to back up mainly, right? You could have baseload in some countries being nuclear, and so you reduce the percentage of your daily, electricity that's variable, and that helps with all of these things. That's not a solution here. It's not an option. There's other countries that have massive, hydro or something like that. But the higher percentage, and Germany's model is 100% of renewables, the bigger problem you're going to have. And this has been a 30-year challenge. So these are obvious things that have been tried. Natural gas was actually, in getting it from Russia, you can understand why industry was so insistent. They didn't really trust the Energiewende, a lot of people. They wanted to see these problems solved first. And then that was taken away. That wasn't very wise. So now there's the LNG offshore floating regasification units, taking in something they used to call dirty American fracking gas, but the minister doesn't say that so much anymore. And now, actually, we have the green minister pushing that. I heard him say 36 to 39 one day, but it's, what's been approved is 25 gigawatts of new natural gas turbine generation. All right? So I think the government, or the country, has a dilemma, right? If you're not going to change the model, if you're not going to like allow nuclear on a massive scale or some way else change the model, if you don't get lucky with some new technology, which we haven't for 30 years, you're going to end up with what I would say is a renewable plus natural gas system, unless hydrogen works. So while hydrogen, unless hydrogen works or some form of that. Okay, well, let's see. Let me just give an example. So one idea is to go to Africa, and to go all over the world. It turns out there's a number of countries I thought offhand that aren't even, this was a Fraunhofer study, a year or two ago, I think, and they were looking at if the infrastructure was already in place, what it would take. So as we know, that's a big if, right? But it was interesting to see the scale on which things are being thought of. You know, this is amazing. I mean, this is on the scale. When's the last time Germany did something like this? You know, I mean, before World War II, there was convert the whole system of oil to coal, right? There was the idea of proposing that the Russians should build this huge gas network, which the idea actually came from the West and convinced the Central Committee to build it in the first place. Or, you know, and this kind of thing, or the Energiewende, and this is another mega program, and this one is to fix the Energiewende. So I'm going to just because Deutsche Welle asked me about it, I could have picked various countries, but one day they asked me about Mauritania, and I got into it a bit more. And this is from something I posted on my blog, just so I'll go through quickly. Let me just come over here a little more. So Deutsche Welle, I think it was a show I was on, was very impressed in the lead-in. And they said, this project's going to have 10 gigawatts, which they said sounds like 6 to 7. Actually, it could be 9 or 10 nuclear power plants, okay? And the first phase is to be completed by 2028. When you listen to the CEO of the company, the German company that's kind of overseeing it, it'll have a 400 megawatt capacity in 2028, which is 1/25 of that. So it's a little less, okay? So we're talking long timelines. So I just wanted to interrogate it and go through. I can give you all the references. Actually, the references are on my blog, the studies I used to pick my numbers. If we assume that 0.4 gigawatt capacity running flat out, with all year round with a 40% capacity factor, that would lead 1.4 terawatt hours of green hydrogen. And BNetze, the Bundesnetzagentur, said that natural gas imported into Germany in 2023 was 968 terawatts, of which 7%, almost 70 terawatts was LNG. So let's say the gas comes in whatever form, and it's aimed at the LNG, okay? And just see what that does for us. This is where I got some of the, I can give you the references for the studies. It turned out that, okay, then the other thing I do, I'm not going to take you through it all, you have to get it to Germany. And so, as Dawood said, technically, as far as the percentage losses of the gas itself, the efficiency would be to make chilled H2, liquefy it and transport it, and bring it here. You could make it as green ammonia. It makes the transfer much simpler, but there's other problems. So anyway, that's one idea. I mean, I just point out that I've done cryogenics. You got to get it down to 20 degrees above absolute zero Kelvin, under 600 or 700 bar to do this. But anyway, and the ship you'd have to build, the insulation and the pressure, right? But anyway, say that's done. I'm just looking at the efficiency of transferring the product, not the cost here, all right? This ends up replacing what they would produce at 1.1 gigawatt hour, or 1.6% of its 2023 LNG imports. That's 0.1% of the total natural gas imports. It's quite small, right? However, this doesn't say anything about the costs, and which is quite different. I don't think anybody's going to import liquefied natural gas. Nowadays, after I've complained about that, I'm liquefied H2 because of the technical problems and the cost. And almost everybody, you talk from a ministry or from one of the think tanks who are very pro this, will say, well, yes, green ammonia. Okay, so now, well, I think I probably talked quite a while. I would just, if you're interested, I could give some tech reflections. Yeah, I was a nuclear safety officer and incident commander. So in other words, if there was an incident, a bomb or a chemical, terrorist attack, I could be in charge of it until the commander of the commander of the fire department arrived. Okay, so I went through different things with the FBI in the States and other things to see what you do. Let's just say, maybe later off the record, I remember this one chart of all the various things ranging from dirty bombs, what you could use for terrorism, up through various chemicals, and there was one way up here in the corner. I said, what the heck's that? Well, it was one of these two gases used in a certain way, and I won't say how. This is not good to have this stuff all over the place. And I would just point out that the explosions at Fukushima were not nuclear explosions, they were hydrogen explosions. What happened is the hydrogen disassociated from oxygen on the surface of the zirconium rods that got quite hot, and it accumulated inside. And unlike the Swedes, they didn't have fans to get rid of it. And all you have to do is turn on a light or something, and boom, or some spark, and it all went back to water and released the energy, right? And that's what those explosions actually were, hydrogen gas. So if you have a leak in a room with hydrogen gas, I'm quite sure it'll stay up here. Because I've sort of accidentally done things like this, and you don't want to come under this. I mean, for a long time, because it's very light and stuff. So in order to use these gases, especially ammonia, yes, it's used in industry, at chemical plants, and various places, but the discussions I've heard about, we can use it for a fuel and heavy transport, we're going to use it on ships, and so forth. The safety considerations. If you want, you can use it as a refrigerant, say, it's commonly used, it's got a very good heat capacity in the phase transition. Only water is better. So you can actually use it at an industrial level to do refrigeration. So I had a license to do this when I was in university. And so you could actually use it, it's what they use as a refrigerant in a large brewery or a large dairy. But by code, at least in the United States, where it's handled, it has to be in a separate sealed building outside everywhere else. And when you go in, there's masks hanging on the side. You either keep one with you, or you got to be able to get to the mask quick, because it's not going to be good for your lungs, and when you start to smell a leak. So I think some of this I don't see as realistic as far as the tech side and using. So anyway, I think, well, there is a dilemma, and it's been there from the beginning, and even the proponents of 100% renewables always said it was there, and it's this variability, and you do need some grid scale storage. De facto, it's going towards natural gas. That's what's being imported. Tremendous capacity to make electricity from natural gas is being installed. It's not irrational. It has to be done to prevent, economic problems morphing into deindustrialization, right? So the only solution within that model you can think of is to replace it with a green gas, which is technically difficult. For grid scale storage, it's never going to be done. For, the efficiencies of burning this in a heat engine after the efficiencies are so long and bringing it here simply won't happen, in my opinion. For specialized use is fine for hydrogen. So only model I can see is to reform the Energiewende, and Energiewende 2.0, we have a massive baseload of nuclear. And by the way, nuclear can make, hydrogen pretty efficiently also. So that's my take on it.
While we've got Roman here, I wanted to ask him specifically, because Ukraine played and continues to play a very important role in supplying gas to Europe. In the old days, pre-war, that Russia was exporting something like 150 billion cubic meters to Europe. It was about 35% of the mix. Now that Nord Stream's been destroyed, there's still the gas pipeline going through Ukraine, still transiting Russian gas to the tune of, despite the recent problems and Suzda being captured by the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kursk incursion, but it's still coming, 42 million cubic meters a day. And that dipped, but has still coming. And that adds up, I think, I'm right, Roman, you can confirm, that it's about 15 BCM a year. So it's a tenth of what it was, but it's still a significant amount. And going forward, I mean, Ukraine has massive pipe capacity, 146 BCM a year it can cope with. It also has by far the largest gas storage tanks in Europe. I think they're twice the size of Germany, which is the second largest. And Ukraine is also, the transit deal is due to expire this December, and the government said that it's not going to renew the transit deal with Russia. However, there are talks going on with Azerbaijan. It's already sending 13 BCM, and it's talking about doubling that to 20 BCM, and that gas will go through Ukraine. In addition, the government in Kiev, I mean, he was mentioning various projects, but there's been a lot of talk about biogas, which is a sort of green alternative methane. Roman, I was just wanting to ask you, I mean, what role is Ukraine going to play? If the transit deal is going to be cancelled, is the Azerbaijan solution realistic? And also,
you need to stop here, please.
I need to stop?
If you need to ask him, you need to stop here to hear you.
Did you hear what I was saying? I had to stand here, he says. Yeah? Please, go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, he is.
Okay. Starting from the transit issue, the President Zelensky told us we will have no deals with Russia.
Starting from the transit issue,
simultaneously we
the
see
President Zelensky
negotiations
told that we will have no deals with Russia in terms of gas transit and its period.
potential
Simultaneously, we see
of the Ukrainian system.
negotiations
So I think it's still not
with
clear
Slovakia
whether any
regarding
Slovakian or
potential
other European company
capacity
could
bookings of the Ukrainian
book
system.
capacities
So I
of
think
Ukrainian
it's
gas
still
system
not
with
clear
entry points on the
whether
border
any
with Russia
Slovakian or
and
other
exit
European
points
company could
on the respective
book
borders with,
capacities of Ukrainian gas
Ukrainian
system
EU member states.
with
So
entry
it's
points
still not
on
clear.
the
However,
border with Russia
as we have
and exit points
compliant
on the respective
legislation in terms
borders
of
with
system
Ukraine and EU
operation,
member states.
anyone
So it's still not clear. However,
participate in the capacity
as
auctions
we have
of our TSO and
compliant
the capacities.
legislation in
By
terms
the way, it's
of
not only
system
east-west
operation,
direction, but
anyone
also
could
north-south and
participate
south-north.
in
So
the
we can,
capacity auctions of
we
our TSO
offer
and book the
transmission
capacities.
capacity
By the
also
way,
with
it's not
entry
only
point in
east-west
the
direction,
south,
but also
at the border with
north-south and south-north. So
Romania,
we can
and
we
exit points
offer
will be
transmission
elsewhere.
capacity
So,
also
we
with entry
combine this
point
also with
in the south
with,
at the border
the
with
ability to store gas in
Romania.
So I would
exit
say
points
that
could be
definitely we will
elsewhere.
not
So
have that
we will combine this offer
much of
with
transit. However, last year it was slightly
the
over
opportunity to store
14
gas in these solutions.
billion cubic meters.
So
which
I would
is
say that
peanuts.
definitely we would not
So
have
the exit
that
capacity is
much of transit.
140
However, last
BCM.
year it was
So
slightly
you might imagine
over
it's
14
slightly over
billion
10%
cubic meters, which
for
is
utilization.
peanuts.
And we will
So
definitely
the
need to
exit capacity is
optimize
140 this year.
improve the system
So
functioning
imagine
for
it's
much smaller volumes.
slightly
of
over
gas.
10%
In this
of
regard, I
utilization,
would like to
and we will
indicate not
definitely
only
need to optimize
the role
and
Ukraine,
improve the
especially
system
Europe,
functioning
play
for
in terms
much
of,
smaller volumes of
natural
gas.
gas supply.
In this regard, I would like to
By
indicate not
far the
only
largest,
the role Ukraine,
Norway and
as
UK,
future EU member, can
we are
play in
the
terms
largest gas
of
producer in
natural
Europe.
gas supply,
And if we
because we are
invest in energy
by
efficiency
far the
measures,
largest,
in
if we exclude
measures to
Norway and
decarbonize
UK,
district
we
heating,
are the largest gas
we
producer
may
in
have
Europe, and if we
quite substantial
invest
surplus
in
terms of
energy
natural gas
efficiency
which can be
measures, in
exported.
measures to decarbonize
It's
district
kind
heating,
of mid-term
we may have
opportunity.
quite substantial
But I would
surplus
also
in
like to
terms of
point
natural gas which can be
to another
exported.
renewable gas,
And
which
it's
is
kind of midterm
overlooked,
opportunity.
but it is an
But I would
immediate
also like to
I mean,
point
by
to
mistake.
another renewable
It
gas,
can be produced
which is
in big quantities as we
overlooked,
are large agriculture
but it
country
is
and
an
we have
immediate opportunity.
residues
I mean
and waste
biomethane.
we can use.
It can be produced in big quantities, as we are a large agricultural country and we have residues and waste we can use for producing first biogas and then biomethane. And we also already have first projects, first industrial projects of biomethane production. Mainly agricultural companies are installing additional equipment to convert their biogas they use for cogeneration for biomethane. However, in terms of potential exports to the EU, using the pipeline infrastructure of fossil gas, we have still challenges. And those challenges are not primarily on the Ukrainian side, also on the other side. So far we have one industrial biomethane facility stopped operating, so the producer converted back to biogas production for cogeneration because it cannot monetize this project because it cannot get the premium on renewable gas in Germany, for instance, due to the lack of regulation. So what is needed? So there are several steps needed to enable supply of biomethane from Ukraine via pipelines to Germany, and for this premium to be possible in that way to support this emerging industry, which in the first stages will be purely export-oriented. First, we need to have a bilateral agreement between EU and Ukraine on the way to confirm the sustainability of this links, the way we will be part of this European database for biofuels. Second, we need Germany to comply with the rule of European Court, EU Court, in terms of accepting biomethane at border crossing. Then we will need to change the Section 44B of renewable energy law in Germany, because currently it enables premium only for biomethane produced inside the country, not biomethane received under mass balance rule at interconnection points with Poland, for instance, or with other countries. And last, it's also some kind of adjustment of the service regulation of the customs office, main customs office in Frankfurt and Oder, which has to clear those volumes to include countries of origin outside the European Union. So those four steps would enable for Ukrainian producers of hydrogen to inject those volumes in our gas system, and then using mass balance rule and things related to
can I ask you
to take off those volumes in Germany or other country of the European Union with such support scheme. Otherwise, it is only
Can I ask you just briefly, what is the potential of the biogas industry in Ukraine? As you mentioned, it's a massive agricultural producer, and you have all those waste, the chaff at the end of the harvest season that can be converted. Do you have any idea of what the potential is? How much gas could be produced when everything comes to fruition?
It's a massive agricultural producer, and you have all those waste, the chaff at the end of the harvest season that can be converted. Do you have any idea of what the potential is? How much gas could be produced when everything comes to fruition?
So before the war, the plans was to reach, I think, 10 billion cubic meters by 2035. Currently, those plans have been corrected and reduced, but in general,
potential
have the numbers not only from Ukraine, but
is 11
we have the numbers of
terawatt-hours by
Zukunftsgas. It's
2030.
a German
And the
association.
total potential,
So the potential
take all
of
the
production is
residues
11
of agricultural
terawatt
production,
hours by 2030.
the
And the total
220
total
terawatt-hours
potential,
of
we can
biogas.
take
Right.
all the
Okay.
all the residues of
So it's
agricultural
quite high
production
volume,
is
which
220
can be,
terawatt hours
without any
biogas.
gasification, you can use the existing
So
gas
it's
infrastructure.
biomethane, sorry.
And
So
to
it's
supply
quite high
those,
volume,
green gases for
which
I mean,
can
for me,
be,
the whole Ukraine as a potential
without
source of
any
energy for Europe is very
modification,
interesting
you
because
can
they have
use the
multiple
existing gas
options
infrastructure
between the
and to
bio
supply
that under
those,
Poroshenko there was
green
massive
gases
investment
for
into
the EU.
renewables. That's already up to 25% of the energy mix, and Ukraine became a net exporter of power. It was hooked into the European system the day before the war started, and began exporting. I mean, now it's being reversed to get through this winter. They're trying to import. There's not enough available. Tom, I think at this point we should open up for Q&A.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions or something they'd like to discuss. Yeah? Alec? You do.
So the International Renewable Energy Agency says that almost 47% of global hydrogen production comes from natural gas, 27% comes from coal, 22% comes from oil as a byproduct, and only around 4% from electrolysis, raising concerns about its true green credentials. Added to the known challenges when it's transportation and storage, how viable is hydrogen as a long-term energy solution compared to other renewables like solar or wind energy?
Yeah. You want to go for it? No, no, okay. I think one thing to understand about hydrogen, you have to watch some people give sort of this techno-optimism. If we put all this money in, we're gonna produce it much more cheaply in new ways. I mean, it's all great to do this research, but this is an industry that's what, as a massive industry, 120 or something years old. I say there's a lot of ammonia produced to make fertilizer, of course, but the other huge use is in refineries, because when you have a hydrocarbon chain, if you're going to split it, well, when you split between the two carbons, you need two carbon molecules. You need to stick two hydrogens on there, right? So if you want to split these long, heavy chains of crude oil and make lighter stuff like petrol, diesel, whatever, or aviation fuel, you need to feed in a lot of hydrogen. And so big chemical companies have been working on this for as long as you can imagine to optimize it. Now, if I would tend to say, I remember teaching about electrolyzers 20 years ago and looking into it. There's a lot of hope in this sort of thing. I don't think it's so easy to make advances in electrolyzers, just simply because it's been out there, and big companies have been, industrial companies who would be very happy to make it that way if it was cheaper would do it. There's some possibilities of making it with nuclear. The problem, it can be done actually pretty easily. The problem with running, there's experimental places that were set up in Iowa at the US DOE facilities where they have experimental reactors. The problem is the temperatures that you do that at erodes the pipes, and so you have to coat the pipes with ceramic, and you don't want a lot of vibrations. So there's different ways that might go in the future, but so I don't think there's a great potential to produce so-called green hydrogen efficiently to compete with these other ways of producing it. That's one of the big problems. Without talking about the different technologies, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, if it's like a good solution in a long-term wise against other renewable energies.
well, it has to be produced from renewable energies. It's an energy carrier. It's like a battery. It doesn't produce the energy itself. The energy has to be stored as hydrogen. So it has to be produced from renewable sources, windmills and solar, and that's where you get in. Maybe if you're lucky, the the efficiencies, well, anyway, there's a big loss of the renewable power in creating hydrogen. And so it depends on when is it worth it and when is it not.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I would perhaps just like to highlight. So first, I'm to highlight this. I'm absolutely not a proponent of hydrogen as an energy carrier or anything. I do nonetheless see that the discussion today is perhaps similar to many other discussions, somewhat diverging into strawman arguments that actually aren't really part of the debate. So first, when we talk about hydrogen, generally speaking, in 2024, virtually no one is talking about using hydrogen for power production. That is not what the discussion is about at all. So we talk about using hydrogen in hardest to decarbonize, particularly industrial applications. So the steel industry, for instance, and similar industries where, secondly, also large-scale transportation, such as aviation or maritime fuels. So simply areas where even, I'm absolutely not a friend of electric vehicles. Actually, I find that is far more gross debate, to be honest. But let's even accept that electric vehicles are an option for anything. This will definitely not be the case for airplanes or for large freighter ships. So we talk about hydrogen for areas where simply other renewables are not really an option. So the option that you have is either you keep using the fuels that you already have, or you switch to hydrogen-based fuels in those, or hydrogen itself in those cases. And that particular point, yes, hydrogen is not. Hydrogen on its own in a free market doesn't have a business case. It absolutely doesn't. It does exactly the same, if not less, than what natural gas is doing, just at a far higher price. So the commercial case for hydrogen does only exist, and I would completely agree with Tom in that particular regards, that I'm personally very skeptical when it comes to a lot of estimates about the cost curve of hydrogen, to which extent it will decrease. We will definitely see some cost decreases. I'm very skeptical with respect to the steepness of the curve that some project. So I would say, but no matter what you assume, so at least for the next 20, 30, 40 years, hydrogen will, on a purely economic perspective, not be able to outpace other energy carriers, generally speaking. So this doesn't become a cost. This doesn't become a question of is there a valid business case, but it's a political question. This is a market that is not a potential market that is not grounded in market realities, but in political realities. It simply becomes a political question of, are you, as a country, as a European Union, as in whoever, is switching away from natural gas, is it worth paying the additional premium that you have from realizing the same thing that you could do via natural gas using hydrogen? You could, yes, in theory, you could obviously say one option is to say I absolutely don't care about the CO2 emissions. That's an option. You could say, well, there are CO2 emissions, but whatever, in 10 years from now, I use direct air capture to do this, which will also have pretty high cost, obviously. So the actual question is not hydrogen compared to other energy carriers, but it is rather, how much is hydrogen worth for me in terms of means to decarbonization? And so this becomes, in that regard, far more a political debate than it is a techno-economic debate.
Please. If you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I would like to add a couple of positive notes and also have a question. For context, my name is Nora. We're an electrolyzer manufacturer. So obviously, I think the basis is that we believe that green hydrogen going to be a really big part of this decarbonization future. I think just from my perspective, what I want to add is it's obviously that green hydrogen at the moment is not cost competitive to grey hydrogen and also not to natural gas. But I think this is the fundamental thing that we have to change in the upcoming years with subsidies, with policies, with regulation. And I think from my point of view, we're on a good way getting there. Currently, grey hydrogen is between 2 and 3 euros per kilo. Green is between 10 and 15. Maybe you can add to that what you see as well. But how do you gap this green premium, right? This is the question. And I think what we've seen in the mobility sector, where I have also some experience, is that with called THG quota, they have actually tried to bridge that gap with a really smart policy. So right now, it's subsidized heavily between 6 and 8 euros per kilogram, which making it somewhere a little bit more affordable. But what we see as well is a lot of interest from industry, like glass manufacturers, like steel, like refineries. And I think there we need to have more regulation and also more subsidies that actually makes this attractive as a business case. And then, of course, we need to scale as well. So I think the need for that is there. And also the policies are getting there. So actually, in our point of view, this 10 gigawatt that we are looking for having in Germany until 2030 is somewhat in an achievable range if we now really start acting with more subsidies and more political pressure. And my question now is, I think, more about raw materials, because you said that currently raw materials are scarce, obviously. How do you see, is that going to slow down the development of electrolyzer from your point of view? And how can we bridge that from your point of view? That's my question. And then there are more questions, of course, we can.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora, for the question. And also thanks for highlighting those numbers. It's always super important, interesting to get the insights from the industry, actually. I would perhaps just like to highlight with respect to that. So I do definitely believe on a positive note, I completely second, that I see what we will see is the decarbonization of existing hydrogen production. As you actually started today's talk, hydrogen is already a giant market due to its usage in refineries and so on. And also perhaps talking, so reshifting the role, so from a Gulf perspective, for instance, so what we see is that there is, in fossil fuel-rich countries, a strong push towards saying the existing fossil fuel industry, yes, that will be kept. That is a core business that we have. However, it should be decarbonized. So decarbonizing refineries, decarbonizing the value and supply chain of fossil fuels, that is definitely something that's going to happen. And so that's definitely something where I see electrolyzers, obviously, no matter if hydrogen will be established as an energy carrier, to which extent, decarbonizing the existing hydrogen demand, that is definitely something that is happening. However, just one perhaps point on the cost of grey hydrogen. The issue that, I mean, this is not just an hydrogen issue. This is an overall issue with renewables and clean energy transitions. That obviously price effects in a market are to some extent working against this. Meaning that if there really was to be a substantial shift towards hydrogen, then that would mean to some extent, or most likely, it would mean that natural gas might become cheaper because there's less demand, and less demand on natural gas could in turn obviously improve the economics for grey hydrogen, so to say. So this kind of, or at least it's rebound effect some way that is in the fossil fuel sector, that is obviously not just the hydrogen thing, it's a general clean energy transition thing. With respect to the question that you have, so generally speaking, I mean, depending obviously on which technology you're using, I assume perhaps PEM electrolyzers or mainly.
We have developed a new way.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I really want to hear more about this. So generally speaking, what we generally found is that access to critical raw materials is not likely going to be a constraining factor to production itself. It is, however, something that could map into political and geopolitical risks. So to name, for instance, PEM electrolyzers as one particular example, technology that is highly reliant on platinum group metals, which, as we know, are to the largest extent only coming from South Africa. You may now say, well, South Africa sounds like a friendly nation, and alliances are shifting, friends are shifting. So in the broader sense, friendshoring, or believing that, well, it is a critical mineral, but it is in a friendly nation, so I don't care about it. This is something that we particularly want for that we want policymakers against. That access to critical raw materials is a new major power source in terms of geopolitics. However, that doesn't necessarily need to translate into supply into issues of access for producers, I would say. Would you like to add, or?
Thank you very much. My name is Holger Klitzing. I'm from the Foreign Office. There was a lot of interesting food for thought by the panelists, a lot of worth commenting on. I'll pick on a few things. Thank you for adding a positive note at the end, because I concur. The political will is still there. The hydrogen import strategy has been mentioned, and also at the European level, I think step by step we're moving forwards, but maybe not fast enough. And I agree, there's more realism now that we're seeing, not as much hype, but nevertheless, I think things are moving in the right direction. And at the end of the day, we always have to ask which are our alternatives. And I think hydrogen has to play a key role at the very end, because there are industrialized sectors that we cannot electrify. Electrification is, the first path to choose, but at the end, there's a delta that we need to fill by hydrogen, which is costly. Fair enough. So public money cannot do it. We need private engagement, private investment. We're not there yet to see the business case. On the other hand, we also need to consider the cost of inaction. The climate crisis is progressing. It's progressing fast, and it will affect us all. And of course, this has a big price tag. And at the end of the day, it might be worth paying maybe the green premium. And there's another premium we have to pay, which is the security premium. Diversification is the buzzword in that regard. We don't want to have all our hydrogen come through just one pipeline. We know what could happen. So definitely this might not lead to the most cost-efficient supply always, but bottom line, it should be balanced, but it's still a price tag. But speaking of price tag, recently H2 Global announced the result of its first auction. So there will be green ammonia coming from Egypt at the end of the decade, and if you calculate the price, I think it was about €4.5 per kilogram of hydrogen, which is much lower than most of the numbers that are out there as estimates. And that's not an MOU, that's a real binding delivery commitment. So I think that is definitely a big light at the end of the tunnel. It will not move the market by itself, but it is definitely a very positive sign. I have one question. I don't want to have a talk here. Thinking of the United States, in particular the IRA, there was a lot of ado about it being so simple for companies. They were all excited, and people were worried that all the hydrogen production would go to the United States in electrolyzer production, but nobody had read the fine print yet because it wasn't out there. Now it has been published, at least in the consultative phase, and surprise, surprise, it looks very similar to the delegated act, and it's not even finalized, and some say it's even tighter. So I'd be curious what your take is on the IRA, which role the United States will play in that Brave New Hydrogen world. Thank you very much. And I'm not talking about the nuclear question, but that's...
You guys?
I just quickly, I know we got other hands here. I just say, regarding the United States, I think, I happen to be from there, but the plan is much more rational than the German plan. What I constantly hear is people say, we have to do it because what are we going to do? It's the law or whatever. And that was the same thing I heard said for years about cellulosic ethanol, as far as, and also about the hydrogen economy for automobiles. And they basically ended after a lot of money was invested and the technical problems weren't overcome sufficiently. So if you go back to the 1990s even, in early 2000s, when we started talking about a lot of this stuff, it was clear there was this German model where you want 100% renewables. And everything about it was you had to do all this development. But in the business, it was kind of like, but you don't really need to do any development. We know how to decarbonize. The French have already done it. They did it with massive nuclear. Works perfectly fine. We also knew what to do about mass transit. You needed massive mass transit. The problem was, at the time, with the tendency, you could label it different things, towards neoliberalism or whatever, but it was entering a period where governments didn't want to spend huge amounts of money and weren't very good at it. So, but to relieve some of these problems of critical minerals, of how you're going to get enough batteries, there's all sorts of significant problems, say, in decarbonizing transit. Massive mass transit would alleviate a lot of these, but no government really wants to do this, because then, in fact, the Green Party here literally was going and blocking building new trains in some places, which it just seemed, irrational. So I think the problem is the model. It's not that there isn't a dire situation. There is a dire situation, and I think we have to sit back and look at the models. And in the United States, I've talked to a guy, an official from the DOE just a couple weeks ago, and he says, we were talking about the situation. I don't want to speak for the DOE, but let's just say, how are they going to do this? Where are they going to get all this hydrogen from? Yes, we're putting billions of dollars. We put billions of dollars into lots of things, and there's certain particular things we want to use hydrogen for that it might work. And I talked to the CEO of one of the biggest hydrogen companies in the United States, and he says, Tom, stop. I agree with all your problems. We're just exploring this. No one's proven you can put 15, 20% in a pipeline. It might not work. I'm a venture capitalist. We put a lot of money in it, So it's a really different idea. They know they need massive nuclear, for example. And hydrogen is, you shouldn't just look at the billions. It's got very specific places maybe it's being used. Anyway, I think...
We'd just like to take one minor point. Thank you so much, Holger, for outlining those quintessential points. And especially since you mentioned also the delegated act, so I would even actually very strong. We recently out that in one of our papers, that I do think hydrogen regulation is actually one of the things that the European Union has. I mean, it took quite a while, obviously, a very, very long while, but eventually, no. I mean, in this new geopolitics of the energy transition, the ability to be able to set standards is inherently important thing. And the EU has. I mean, even if you look into what other countries are increasingly adopting to or looking at, it just mainly match Europe's approach to regulating hydrogen. So this has. I would label, at least from a geopolitical perspective, a success story. And to add one minor point on the IRA. One perhaps other lens to look at this is to the question of what exactly is the motivation that the US has for going into hydrogen. So one of the things that we at least find I'm not saying we say this is the dominant reason, but one of the main reasons that we see in hydrogen from an IRA perspective is actually systemic rivalry with China, and the idea of the IRA not being a tool for climate action per se, but mainly the IRA being a US tool to secure through industrial policies certain key industries where the US considers it necessary to compete with China. And so if this is the case, then obviously things might look a little bit different, even if the business case isn't necessarily going to make it.
Two more. This gentleman was first, and then you. Okay. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. Klaus Bonhoff. I used to run the National Organization for Hydrogen Fuel Cells in Germany. I was Director General at the Ministry of Transport. I'm more independent now. I've been working on hydrogen for over 20 years as an engineer. I'm not sure I heard from the panel that green hydrogen is coming in the end, so I also would like to add a little more positive twist to it. And there were some remarks that somewhat puzzled me too, because I think the experience with hydrogen is better than what we've heard here on the panel, especially when it comes to safety questions and these kind of things. We've seen millions of refuelings at HRSs throughout the world being safely done, so I wouldn't be concerned as an engineer about the safety aspects. Not saying that certain standards have to be, of course, in place and be well maintained. There would be a few things I would comment. I would really start with your introduction, and I suggest to give it a different spin. The question is not how much green hydrogen do we have today and what needs to happen in order to kind of multiply that by a factor of 100. The real question, and that is the global competition we see ongoing right now, how do we in the end achieve our CO2 reduction targets? And we have throughout the globe regions in the world that have set by law targets to be CO2 neutral by Germany 2045, Europe by 2050, China by 2060. So in the end, we will see a large increase of renewable energies, and I fully take the story of biofuels and all that, but their potential in the end is limited. So if you look at the real amount of renewables, we're talking about wind and solar. And my answer to your question would have been a different one, because in the end, if you want to increase renewables with wind and solar, you need hydrogen, because otherwise you have no way to make sure that this green energy can be used on time on where you need it to, where it needs to be. So in order to make it transportable and flexible, you need to have green molecules. And the starting point for green molecules is the electrolyzer technology. This goes into also the raw material question, of course, but I think we can learn a lot from what we've seen with battery technology. And I'm talking about more geopolitical things. Look at the dominance that Asia and specifically China has in the battery field, specifically because they, for decades, made sure that they actually got access through all those raw materials. So now talking away electrolyzers to, you know, some technology out there. No, it's the key technology to make sure that renewables are successful. And if we do want some part of the industrialization of all of this taking place, whether it's the US or in Europe, we need to make sure that we secure these value chains. So I would even turn your argument around. You were talking about long value chains being a difficulty in order to get to the business cases. They are a real chance and opportunity to make sure you maintain jobs in Europe. So I think that didn't hear a lot about that either, so might not really be a question, and there's another few things I noted here, but really I would like us all to be more optimistic about, you know, what role will and can green hydrogen play, and maybe also in respect to our Ukrainian friend here, I certainly hope that we will see opportunities of getting green molecules from the southeastern part of the European continent, and when importing hydrogen, it's not only a matter of how do we get it here. And I could go into the core net discussion in Germany, and 60% of existing gas pipelines being retrofitted to also take 100% hydrogen. So that is feasible. It's not that, you know, black and white world, but it is feasible. It's not only those technical questions and economic questions, it is also around sustainability and why would a country like, and now let me get away from Ukraine and go to Namibia, since I had the opportunity to visit that country last year. Why would Namibia export green molecules to Europe? That's only their second or third step. In the first step, they're looking at providing renewable energies to their own needs and making sure that they can be part of the value chain and part of the bunkering business that's taking place for large ships that come along the west coast of Africa. And then only once you have abundant amounts of renewable energy production and whatever kind of green molecule, and I don't go into the discussion on ammonia, methanol, and all that. Only once you have abundant energy, then you would start thinking about exporting. And that's the opportunity, especially for the global south. We've seen the map, we've seen the potentials for wind and solar, and why wouldn't any country in this world look into the potential business case of trading green molecules? We need a global agreement of what we call sustainable hydrogen, but in the end, money will be diverted into that direction, I'm pretty sure of, because again, in the end, we all globally will have to reduce CO2. Sorry for not having a question.
Thank you. If I can answer this one briefly, that's all very interesting, yes, and I agree, and particularly the point about the Global South, who have embraced it. I've been writing a series of pieces recently about China, who's become a global green energy. The amount of renewables they've invested, it just overtook coal as their production. But then other countries like Azerbaijan, a stated energy plan, you know, a fossil fuel producer, but they want to sell green energy to Europe. And on Friday, I'm off to Uzbekistan, which has completely embraced it. You know, the EBRD were pushing green energy on them, on the government, and they were like, oh, development bank, but there's some money, so we'll take it. And they've absolutely embraced it. And they're already at 25% of their energy mix, and they want to go to 40, which was beyond what they said. And I agree also, the key point I think you made was that you need abundant amount of renewable energy. And then once you have an abundant amount, then the whole options of hydrogen, and that's the place you take it when you have that money, that capacity. But nobody's at that stage yet. You know, the green energy available is insufficient. So there needs to be doubling of capacity, or I'm not sure what. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, man. Thank you so much for the comments. Just to very quickly add to a couple of points. So, I completely agree. Green hydrogen will be coming. The extent and the magnitude is something that I wouldn't put a needle on. That I say that might be below expectations, but it will be coming. I completely agree with your statement. I love the point that you mentioned value chain, because over the past 6 months I've been intensively working on the issue of employment along the value chain, and I completely agree to your point. However, especially when we now talk about Germany, for instance, the question is how much of the supply chain can actually still be captured. So there is now this re-kickstarted debate about solar energy manufacturing in Germany and so on. And so I generally do see there is a far higher need for strong industrial policy also, and for foresight into those sectors actually, and for both steps for Europe to actually say, yes, this is a strategic value chain that we wish to establish, whichever it may be, and there needs to be a commitment to it, because other countries, it is a global prisoner's dilemma, other countries do go into strategic value chains using industrial policy, and it may be hard to withstand in that. I would, however, like to, don't want to overstretch the time, but to raise one particular concerns. I must say I'm personally always somewhat baffled by the undertone that's swinging along in this discussion. Country X, YZ, Namibia, or be it whomever, shouldn't export hydrogen because their sector isn't ready yet. My issue with that statement is that A, it is incredibly paternalistic and borderline colonialist. To say that Germany eventually, as a country of the European Union, decides what another country gets to produce or not to produce. And secondly, it somewhat ignores just how free markets work. We could make exactly the same argument in a number of different things. We could make the country Y, country XYZ has children starving and still they're exporting agricultural products. We could say Y is country XYZ producing gold and nonetheless no one is able to wear gold in that country. So we could make that argument for everything, and I think it might be worth generally having a debate on the nature of capitalist global trade, which does have its ironies, generally speaking. But if Nigeria, for whatever reason, sees that, well, that's where the margins are. They probably aren't, I would agree. So I would completely agree that that's probably a waste of potential. But if country X, Y, Z sees that's where the margins are, then, well, that's how global trade works.
Please.
Thanks. Enno Haks from BP. I hadn't wanted to say anything until, Tom, you raised your example about mass transport and your big call for mass transport. I would really love to hear your opinion or what your US counterpart said about that call for mass transport compared to Europe that's very far behind. So that was just a joke about a US counterpart. Sometimes you talk to them and then they're really far removed from the discussions we have in Europe. I mean, decades behind in mass transport. But I had another thing to say. I found your presentation a bit sobering, a bit too sobering. So let me make 3 remarks on this. Yes, when you come from abroad and you come to Germany, you look at the Energiewende, you're a bit shocked, I agree. Maybe it's German romanticism that calls us for targets, but I mean, I think we should give it a little respect that there is a democracy that actually really has the impression that we're going to make our contribution to save the climate change. When I travel the world, then I don't see that in many locations. So everybody has signed up to Paris, but according to my knowledge, until last week, only one single continent had any kind of CO2 pricing on manufacturing industry. That was Europe. Nobody nowhere else had any kind of CO2 pricing. So I just want to say, please, let us give a little respect to the overarching romanticism that we find in Berlin and Brussels. Second comment is, yeah, your call for nuclear. Yes, I agree, but maybe one call for effect that maybe you have omitted. We have emission trading in Europe, and the last certificate is going to be handed out in 2039. No, in fact, in December 2038. So there will be 0 certificates. So even if you dream of nuclear being one of the solutions, there will be no new reactor, even if you start building it tomorrow, before 2039. So this is no solution. I think you said it down there. One of the solutions is build more nuclear. Well, I don't see this making any kind of change inside Europe in the next 15 years. And 15 is the number where Brussels has decided that emission trading is down to 0. So this is a statement about what is feasible in the next 15 years. My third comment is, I think after the sobering discussion, the only real question we have is how do we deal with the competitiveness issues? If some countries do decide to go into decarbonizations and most of the world doesn't, so how do we make the rest of the world chip into, I think somebody said here, we need more subsidies, which if I read German newspapers is not going to happen. If you read Brussels newspapers, it's all maybe debt-laden. Maybe that is going to come. I just don't believe that there's going to be more public subsidies. So how do we make, if this is a global problem that cannot be solved in Berlin or in Brussels, how do we make the US pay for a fair share of development? What did you say on your map? Namibia or Algeria or wherever it is where we need the hydrogen from. It is certainly not Europe that's going to pay for that alone. H2 Global is the perfect idea, but certainly not financeable from Europeans alone. So the real question is, how do we deal with competitiveness and make the Americans chip in? Thanks.
Thank you. On the competitiveness thing, my publications, we focus exclusively on emerging markets, frontier markets. And this is the issue. They're coming up very fast. They have very low costs. And yet the technology, they're catching up. Mid-technology in China, they have high-tech now, which they've developed themselves. And we have the burden of, the developed societies, the competitiveness. I don't see how Europe and the States is going to compete with these rising markets in the long run. The only way to do it is to stay ahead technologically, which is, I think, the point of the CHIPS Act and America's fighting back, because it realizes that it needs to keep the lead in technology. But I see that lead fading slowly. So I think this competitiveness thing is a very serious problem.
I want to make a comment, but maybe Roman wants to say something.
I just wanted to reflect on this question on the previous speaker. So I think one of the answers is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where you tax extra those carbon-intensive goods, or you expect from your trade partner to have equivalent rules for carbon pricing, or certificate to prove that cement, that steel, that fertilizers are produced, with that, level of emissions. And as for the previous speaker, regarding, internal market drive or export-oriented, I would say that this is also part of the discussions in Ukraine. Although we speak not about re-industrialization, but about recovery after the war, since the war resulted in this destruction of many industrial facilities. So if we recover, we will not rebuild our steel plants, using older technologies. Of course, we will be looking in different options in the new technologies, and hydrogen is also part of the possible solutions. And another option is, is electrification where possible. It's part of the discussions, but I refer to export orientation as a boost for certain industries. At least it was a case for IT industry in Ukraine, because export contracts actually created those, infrastructure and ability to grow, and now we profit a lot from, from digitalization, from use of IT in military sector. But before that, we had quite export-oriented IT sector, and same could be for biomethane, as I mentioned. So we first grow the industry and promote it using support schemes in other countries, because I don't think that Ukraine would have an opportunity to afford such generous support schemes as other countries can, especially when you have too many other priorities in your public spending after the war. So this could be a boost for the industry to start up. And then if we think about that we also need to install carbon market in Ukraine, we also need to have different incentives to comply with European legislation in terms of sustainability proof, etc. Then with time there will be more incentives for internal market, for internal demand to emerge. And in case of hydrogen, I think it's obvious that first steps would be some islands of production and consumption united in a cluster, so that you can save on transportation costs. And further on, this could develop into bigger volumes of production and use of existing or new infrastructure for exports. So again, this is not kind of a chicken and egg question. I think that you can do both tracks simultaneously, but export-oriented models are appealing in terms of allowing for faster growth and saving on public investment in this regard.
I'd like to, I take Enno's comments and colleagues here. The problem I see, I think we should get or I would suggest that the German government ministries make some sort of scientific technical study. I think what both of us have said is it's not likely, I think it's impossible, but it's not likely that you're going to get sufficient hydrogen as a grid scale storage. This is a fundamental problem of the Energiewende model. You need to have something to back them up. And for all the costs we're talking about getting hydrogen here, then to put it in a heat engine or a turbine, and maybe 60, I don't know what percent efficiency, it's quite on. I just don't see how it's going to happen. Yes, it can be used for certain things to decarbonize certain hard to decarbonize things, maybe. And so the problem I see is there's a problem in the model. If the technology obviously isn't there, and yet there's all these MOUs all over the world that's going to discredit the country in the end if they're not carried out in a competitive way. And that's a serious problem, because with Germany it was always soft power, and the global Energiewende, this was one of the bases that, here we will develop the new technology that will be needed, and it can be exported, and every fair, trade fair everywhere in the world, the Germans were there with, we're going to provide the new technology. Now we know what happened with solar, we know what's happening with wind. Now you can go talk about electrolyzers. So I think the model would be something like, instead of making it a mandate from the top, if you could, this more happens in the States just simply because of the structure. We have separate states. So in different places with grants around national labs, people start using different technologies, and they have conscious plans to say, let's see if we can create a value chain, in this state or with this foreign country as sort of a model. Take a city or something, or certain industries, and see if it can be developed, and to what extent it can be developed, and if it works, then you give it the national plan. But right now there's the illusion that this is going to be used for grid scale storage, and it simply isn't going to work. So you either going to have to stick with the natural gas. And when I first went to the Foreign Office and asked them, what are you going to do? How how are you going to replace this with FSROs, offshore floating, right? Department 410, right? How are you going to replace this? Because nobody wants to take dirty fracking gas. He said, it's beautiful. The minister had this idea the other day. We say in 10 years it's all going to be replaced. We'll only get 10-year contracts, and the onshore ones will all be hydrogen ready. It's great. I said, yeah, semantically it's great, but anyway, I don't know that it's going to happen. And this is a real problem for decarbonization. So I don't know, and you're right, and Enno's right. I mean, Mr. Harks is right. It's very difficult in the east of Europe where they want to build plants. I started a network with think tanks in 12 or something countries for policy on energy for nuclear, and everywhere the discussion is, how do we work with Brussels? We want to do this. Why isn't it on an equal footing? Why can't we do these things? Some of these countries say there's just no other way with renewables we can decarbonize. Germany can't do it. Look at the costs and look what they're doing with these big projects. It's been done in France. Why can't we do this? And so, anyway, I think there's a certain missing of facing the reality that's going to be a disaster for the climate, in my opinion. But I'm getting even worse with disasters.
No, thank you so much. I don't have anything to comment on your intervention. Perhaps just as a last comment from my side, to piggyback on what Tom recently said. So I do really think that, and I'm not just talking about the public sector, I'm also talking about the private sector, that just in Europe is sometimes not aware how damaging the ways how MOUs were conducted have been to Europe as a brand in trade and further. On the one hand, obviously, I wish to say positively that Germany's campaign of H2 Diplo has been a strong success and has been able to eventually lay groundwork for future trade, also far beyond hydrogen, obviously, in many countries where Germany did not necessarily have strong leverage, so to say, or strong connections, and eventually has succeeded in certain areas where even the German chambers of foreign commerce couldn't succeed. So this is definitely a strong story. However, on the other hand, we heard the term diversification tonight, and obviously from a variety of perspectives there should be diversification of hydrogen import sources. Nonetheless, at least from what I'm seeing on the ground, that is at least not the case yet. When it comes to the import countries, the countries that Germany is willing to import hydrogen from at the moment, the list is a fraction of the list that MOUs were conducted with initially, and I would say a necessary step is really taking those MOUs seriously, going for eventually diversifying. And I completely agree. I mean, in the end, I think that's what we said, well, that many said tonight. Eventually, making hydrogen come true is a matter of politics. It is a matter of eventually saying yes. Countries and their constituents, they are willing to pay the premium. If they are willing to pay the premium, and especially on the diversification side, I agree that this is a premium that is totally worth it. This can happen.
And you have to close your eyes and click your heels 3 times, and then it'll come. Me being sarcastic, excuse me. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and for those watching in from outside, to Tom, to Dua, Roman, spasibo вам большое, очень интересно. And we will follow up with email, release the video, and thank you again for coming. Best regards.
If anyone wants to talk to us about building this forum, that would be great.